The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Hillary Clinton's email server remains at the center of the FBI mess, and best-selling campaign biographer Jonathan Allen says her decision to use it was the black cloud that hung over her campaign. Charlie Peters, the legendary founder and editor of the progressive Washington Monthly, reflects that Donald Trump was elected because baby boomers owned stock and became prosperous. And Bill Press talks with former Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood about the need for a massive infrastructure program. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Jonathan Allen is co-author of a hot new book that autopsies the Hillary Clinton campaign, and he believes it was her email server that was the black cloud that hung over the campaign. And we say hello to Jonathan Allen, award-winning political journalist, co-author with Amy Parnes of the best-selling book Shattered: Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign. Jonathan is the head of community and content at Sidewire, columnist for Roll Call, and an adjunct professor at Northwestern University. Jonathan Allen, thanks very much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
It's my pleasure, Jim. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's great to talk with you. So you and co-author Amy Parnes, as I mentioned, have written probably the most talked about post-election book of the season, and the main point seems to be that the Clinton campaign was in many ways dysfunctional. But to be fair, aren't all campaigns flat out messy?
Sure. I mean, there is a quality to campaigns where they're sort of massive startup organizations, and there's always some difficulty with that. But there were issues with this campaign that started with the candidate and kind of her structure of how she built the campaign that I think, were at least symptomatic of some of the problems, including not having a message that a lot of voters could see as being about them rather than her.
Mm-hmm. Now, if she had one, how would your book be different, aside from the title, and what lessons would have been drawn from the detailed reporting that you did?
Actually, the title might have been the same. We had not decided on it until after the election, but Shattered had been considered as something for either a victory or a defeat. Shattered could have referred to the glass ceiling had she won the presidency. But in terms of what would have changed, Amy and I were very careful during the reporting of the book before the election, because a lot of it was done before the election, and the writing, because a lot of the writing was done before the election, to simply report and write what we were learning about different big moments in the campaign from behind the scenes. And, it's interesting. Our editor in October told us he was concerned that he saw so many sort of negative points along the way, and clearly, in his view, she was going to win. And we told him that we were just doing our reporting, and we would try to resolve that, if we had to, or if she ended up winning, tried to figure out, what matched and what didn't. But really, this was a book where we didn't have to go back and tear a lot up, because we had learned a lot that was not known to the public about what was going on internally in that campaign.
Wow, isn't that something? Now, you used the word doomed in the book's subtitle. Why was it doomed?
Well, I think the reason for that is that there's sort of a sense of impending doom throughout a lot of the campaign. Not always. Certainly, she believed she was going to win at the end. Her aides believed they were going to win at the end. But if you start out, even before she launches the campaign, this email server issue arises in March of 2015, and then follows her all the way through the end of the campaign. That was a black cloud that sort of hung over what was going on. I think there were, other issues that it always felt from the perspective of people working on the campaign that there was another shoe that was going to drop. Every time something good happened, something bad followed it. In fact, they had a mantra that we write about, we're not allowed to have nice things.
We're speaking with Jonathan Allen, award-winning political journalist, co-author with Amy Parnes of the best-selling book Shattered: Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign. So, Jonathan, are you saying then that the email servers, say the Comey revelations, her Wall Street connections, and the country's desire for change made it impossible for her to win, even if she had run a perfect campaign?
Well, impossible is a strong word. I think, you've got a very small set of votes that would change in a small set of states for her to win. And I think it was a perfect storm that created the Donald Trump victory. And yet, at the same time, a lot of the wounds, a lot of the deepest wounds were self-inflicted.
What about Bernie Sanders? What effect do you think he and his supporters had in the general election?
Well, it's interesting. I think he brought a lot of people into the process who might not otherwise have been engaged during the Democratic primary, and then he continued to run hard beyond the point at which he could possibly have actually won the nomination. The blood was pretty bad between his camp and her camp, not at the leadership level as much as it was sort of at the grassroots level. And I think, he helped continue for a long time to alienate his voters from Hillary Clinton, and his messaging, particularly that she was corrupt, matched Donald Trump's, and I think embedded that idea in the minds of a lot of voters, and I think probably kept a fair number of his voters from voting for her.
So more than likely, because a Sanders voter is not going to go and turn around and vote for Trump, so these folks just sat at home?
I do think there's some overlap between Sanders and Trump voters. I think there's some percentage of the electorate, and I couldn't quantify it without looking at exit data and doing focus groups and stuff. But I think there is some overlap. I think there was a certain segment of the electorate that simply wanted really, really severe change. I mean, as opposed to restructuring the system, breaking it down and rebuilding it.
So whether it had been Hillary Clinton or not, whatever, we're not going to vote for whoever the Democrat is if it's not a Bernie or something, like Donald Trump.
It's not going to vote for somebody who is the status quo.
Yeah. Now, why did her campaign stop polling the swing states in the last few weeks of the campaign?
A lot of the people I've spoken to for this book, and we go through this in the book, find that inexplicable. The reasoning is basically the campaign manager, Robbie Mook, believed that he could get a pretty accurate read of the horse race, who was up by a couple points or down by a couple points in each state, using data analytics surveys, which are much quicker and cheaper to do, where you really just are asking people who you're voting for. Traditional polling gives you a better sense of what the mood is and may give you a better sense of momentum one way or the other. And I think there were, I know that there were people in the states who were begging for polling and not getting it.
Wow. A lot of lessons learned in this campaign. I imagine things will be handled a lot differently, even starting in the midterms coming up.
I suspect that's right. The Democrats have some searching to do, but they think they have a lot to work with the early Trump agenda and what Republicans in Congress have been voting for. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the midterms, and I think more broadly, interesting to see who Democrats gravitate toward over the next 3 years as a leader of the party. Right now, that's an open seat.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, now, before we let you go, tell us, if you would, about the drama of election night and Hillary's phone conversations with President Obama.
So this book is the first place to really go through the detailed tick-tock of what was going on in Hillary Clinton's suite at the Peninsula Hotel in Manhattan on election night. She and her aides gathered early in the evening, went over her victory speech, never looked at the draft of her concession speech, which is an indication of how they were feeling about the election. There was a slow realization that Florida wasn't coming in well, and that would extrapolate to some of the other states, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. And she was pretty stoic as she was hearing this, I think just trying to process what was going on more than anything else. And then, when the White House determined that she didn't have a chance of winning, President Obama's political director, David Seamus, placed a call to Robbie Mook, the campaign manager, and said the president doesn't want to see her drag this out. That didn't work. Obama then called Clinton and told her she needed to concede. Obama was not completely convinced that he had convinced her. He called his former aide and her campaign chairman, John Podesta, and basically repeated to him what he'd said to Hillary Clinton, which was, there couldn't be any questions about the legitimacy of the election, and waiting to concede would throw those things in doubt, and there needed to be a peaceful transfer of power, and then somewhere in that time frame, I think Obama was probably more persuasive with Clinton than he thought. She decided to cut off the discussion among her aides about whether or not to wait and see if any of the states would flip or if they might trigger automatic recounts. She called Donald Trump, actually Huma Abedin, her top aide, called Kellyanne Conway, the political aide for campaign manager for Trump, and then Trump and Clinton got on the phone. She said those words she never expected to say. Congratulations, Donald. They had a quick conversation, then she sat down at the dining room table in her suite to go over her concession speech with her aides. At that point, Abedin came back with a phone in hand and said, "It's the president." And Clinton visibly winced. She kind of recoiled. This was the moment where it really hit. The president was calling the nominee of the losing party. It was really truly over, and she realized in this moment that she had let herself down and she had let her party down, and she believed she had let the country down, and of course she believed she had let Barack Obama down. So much at stake with his legacy and the continuation of that, and she put the phone to her ear and she said, "Mr. President, I'm sorry."
Wow. Man, to be a fly on the wall in that room. Man, oh man. All right, Jonathan Allen, again, award-winning political journalist, co-author with Amy Parnes of the best-selling book Shattered Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Jonathan, as always, we appreciate your time with us and look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, "Welcome." It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Charlie Peters remembers the New Deal when Democrats identified with the working class and how they have come to look down on them now. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
It's easy to become mesmerized by the Donald Show in this year's political circus, but it's time for progressives to focus on the outer rings, where the Koch brothers, American Legislative Exchange Council, and their corporate cohorts have laid siege to our state governments. It's not a coincidence that such a large flock of corporatists and right-wing ideologues now roosts in state offices and keeps pushing exactly the same anti-people rhetoric and tactics. Nor is their lockstep embrace of identical corporation-enthroning proposals the result of small minds thinking alike. More than a firefight here or an ambush there, the Koch-Alec cabal have launched a massive coordinated maneuver to conquer the countryside. If you doubt that the strategy has gone local, consider this fact. Even though the Kochs did not back a presidential campaign and said they were concentrating on only half a dozen U.S. Senate races this year, they deployed 1,600 paid political staffers into 38 states to drive elections and policy campaigns. This is why we must pay attention. Donald Trump is not the only or even the biggest danger to our democratic republic. As Arne Pearson, General Counsel of Center for Media Democracy, warns, there are a lot of different parts of the Koch machine pulling on this oar. From their think tanks up through their elected officials, they're pushing on it hard. You might think this is madness, but madness, spurred by plutocratic greed, is the new American political reality. Just being progressive won't stop it. We have to get aggressively progressive to confront and defeat the cokeheads in our states. This is Jim Hightower saying, rolling back the effects of the continuing decades-long attack on America's ideal of the common good will take some work. To get started, check out Center for Media Democracy at prwatch.org/CMD.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Magazine editor and essayist Charlie Peters, who grew up during the New Deal, says bluntly that erudite progressives are getting clocked by the simplicity of the other side. And we say hello to a legendary editor and political theorist, Charles Peters. Served in the West Virginia legislature, helped manage JFK's West Virginia primary victory, helped found the Peace Corps, and founded the highly influential Washington Monthly magazine. He is also an author, and his latest, We Do Our Part Toward a Fairer and More Equal America. Charlie Peters, thank you very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Glad to be with you.
Now, it is a pleasure for us to have such an influential political thinker on our podcast. And at 90 years young, you remember the New Deal. What lessons have you learned from that era? And is the role of government in helping people over?
Well, what was remarkable about that era was the spirit of generosity that grew up in it. I think it sprang out of the Depression. People who barely had enough to eat themselves helped feeding other people who were even worse off. I remember the men coming to our back door to asking for food, and my mother feeding them, and that is just one of the most common memories of people who grew up at that time, and that gradually developed into a feeling of the responsibility to your fellow man throughout the country to help him get out of the Depression. So it was a feeling that was first one of generosity to the people that you encountered that needed help, then to the country as a whole, and that was the spirit behind the New Deal, and that led to and to the wonderful that existed during the war, when we had such a remarkable sharing of effort during the war with people. I remember the scrap metal drives and the war bonds, and how much the people of the country sacrificed to help the war effort, and including about 16 million who served in the armed forces. So it was an amazing time, and it made you see what government could do. And because government was accomplishing remarkable things and helping to defeat the Depression, winning World War II, then came the Marshall Plan to rescue Western Europe, then the interstate highway system, and then right after the war, the GI Bill that revolutionized education in America and democratized access to higher education. And then finally topped up by sending the man to the moon. It was just one thing after the other, a remarkable thing the government was doing. So it gave you a faith in what government could do that people just don't have today.
Well, when and why did things start going wrong in Washington?
Well, the things started going wrong in the country as a whole with the Vietnam War. The war divided. The anti-war movement began as largely in colleges with students and professors in college, and I was part of it. I participated in it, and I was against the war. But you saw something unpleasant happening, and that was the beginning of a class division. So because the people who were there was a beginning of a feeling of among the anti-war educated people of looking down on the people who were for the war, and the most famous example, I think, is calling the police pigs, and that, of course, inflamed the police. And for instance, at the Chicago Convention of the Democrats in 1968, it caused riots between the students and the police, and terrible feeling. And so it was the beginning of a class feeling that hadn't existed in the country in the Roosevelt era. It was there had been some social elite social snobbery, but this was the beginning of another kind of class division based on largely, it seemed, on education that had a very unhappy effect on the country.
Now, you mentioned the social snobbery, and if you look at like your money, which is the root of all evil in politics, the lack of civility, gridlock in Washington, that social snobbery that you mentioned, are these the things that helped elect Donald Trump? Oh yes, and the combination of the snobbery and the greed kind of worked together. To take that boomer generation, the people that had supplied the educated part of which had supplied the anti-war movement, they as they around the mid '70s, as the war ended, and they began thinking about making money. It was natural because those young people had formed households. They were needing to. The famous Volkswagen Beetle, which had been their car of choice up until that time, was no longer big enough for their family. So they had to get a station wagon. They had to get a house, and then they decided they had to have a bigger house, and gradually had to have a room for a workout room. They had to have a home office. They had to have walk-in closets. They had to have state-of-the-art kitchens and bathrooms. And to do all that, you began to have to make a lot of money. Well, what happened then was that as they got interested in making a lot of money, their identification switched from we're all together and we want to see a fair deal for workers as well as
as for the bosses and the owners of industry, we were now identifying. We were now the elite was now part of the owners. They were buying stock. There was a show called Wall Street Week that was the most popular show on PBS. It was the Downton Abbey of PBS,
Right.
and so the people got involved. The elite got involved in the making money, in the snobbery, and the two things together separated them from the working class, and that separation has just grown and become worse and worse, and that's why we have Donald Trump today.
We're speaking with legendary editor, political theorist, founder of the highly influential Washington Monthly magazine, Charles Peters, and his new book, We Do Our Part Toward a Fairer and More Equal America. Charlie, your philosophy at one time was, if I'm not mistaken, it was always about promoting a meritocracy in government, industry, and education, where achievement should outweigh class and heredity. Now you're saying that meritocracy has come to be a problem. How so?
Well, the meritocracy it developed its own aristocracy. I mean, it became the new aristocracy instead of it being the democratizing influence. It certainly was in its early days, like during the days of the GI Bill, where it's finally everybody was getting to go to college after the war. Something went wrong, and they started thinking, is my SAT score better than somebody else's? Am I getting in a better college than somebody else? And we were off and running.
Now, you've always praised the smart, well-off people who, from the New Deal through the 60s, went into public service. But now, a lot of smart, rich people are using their wealth and brains to enter politics, but on the far right. What's the difference?
Oh, I think if they enter politics to really do good and to do good for everybody in the country, what it seems like from the early moves of this new administration toward deregulation, lower taxes, that what they're doing is serving the interest of the well-off, and that's not a good reason to enter politics.
Now, is there something to the notion that when Democrats nominate highly educated, erudite people, Carter, Mondale, Dukakis, Gore, Hillary Clinton, they get clocked by people who talk about welfare queens, Morning in America from the Reagan years, the Pledge of Allegiance, and lock her up?
Well, the fact is that they wouldn't have been clocked if they had kept their concern with the average man, and the two people that touch with the average man more closely were Carter in the very beginning. Unfortunately, a lot of events of the inflation and the taking the hostages in Iran were killers to his administration. But with Clinton, it was no question that Clinton had considerable natural appeal to the working man. He talked the working man's language, and I think until he went to New York to live, I think he largely shared those interests. Somehow, he and Hillary got involved way too much in making money, and I think it's one of the great tragedies of the Democratic Party.
Okay. Charlie Peters, obviously a great, legendary editor, political theorist, author of many books, and his newest, We Do Our Part Toward a Fairer and More Equal America, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Charlie, thank you so much for your time. We do look forward to having you back again soon.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with former Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood about the need for a gasoline tax and a massive infrastructure program.
So you and Governor Rendell from Pennsylvania, right, taking the lead in reminding people about the needs to get serious about our infrastructure. What is the state of America's infrastructure today?
Well, if I had to give it a grade, I'd give it an F. We're like a third world country, Bill. I mean,
bad? Wow.
It's bad. 60,000 structurally deficient bridges. 60,000
Really?
60,000. Our interstate systems are crumbling.
So these are bridges that are being used today that people are using.
That's correct. I mean, not the least of which is the one that leads from Washington, D.C. by the Lincoln Memorial across that bridge.
The Memorial Bridge?
Yeah, the Memorial Bridge is in a terrible state of disrepair, and it's on a list right now of one of the top bridges that needs repair. And there have been lots of stories where camera crews have gone underneath the bridge, and the steel beams are rotting. And so, and that's true of a number of bridges, 60,000. Everybody knows our interstates are crumbling. We've had some brutal winters, not necessarily last winter, but prior to that, which have increased the deterioration of the roads. We have transit systems, again, not the least of which our own here in Washington,
right.
D.C., Metro, 40 years old, that haven't kept up with the kind of infrastructure repairs, whether it's on the tracks, whether it's the escalators, whether it's new cars. And that's true all over the country. 40, 50-year-old transit systems that need new infrastructure. We haven't made the investments because the trust fund, which has funded a lot of this stuff over the last 50 years, is broke, hasn't been replenished since...
Because people are not buying as much gas?
Well, because the gas tax hasn't been raised since 1993. And that was the last time the gas tax was raised. Reagan raised the gas tax. George Herbert Walker Bush raised the gas tax. Clinton raised the gas tax. And here we are stuck with a gas tax that doesn't provide near the kind of money that we need to fix up our infrastructure.
What would it cost to do at least to do a decent repair?
Yeah.
On our infrastructure.
What we've been promoting is a 10-cent a gallon increase and index it. If the gas tax had been indexed in 93 to the cost of living, we wouldn't be having this debate. But the problem is it hasn't been raised and it hasn't been indexed. We say 10 cents a gallon, that gets you about $1 billion a year. Trump has talked about $1 trillion infrastructure plan. You got to raise the gas tax in order to get to $1 trillion. You just do.
Yeah.
You can't do it. You can't do it with just public-private partnerships, which are fine. We funded a lot of those while I was at DOT. You can't do it with just tolling. You can't do it with just an infrastructure bank, which Obama proposed 5 different times, and Republicans wouldn't go along with it. Now they seem to think it's a good idea. You have to raise the gas tax and really give the kind of signal that you want to raise a big pot of money to begin to fix up these roads and bridges.
You mentioned the $1 trillion. I mean, coming into this administration, this is something Bernie Sanders talked about,
right.
Hillary Clinton talked about, Barack Obama did when you were there as Transportation Secretary. Donald Trump has. It looked like the one area where there was a bipartisan accord and agreement that this was going to be a top priority. Now, here we are in May. I haven't heard anything about it since January.
Yeah.
What's going on? Is there any legislation? Is there any effort to really get moving on this?
There's a lot of talk, but not much action, and mainly because the Trump people wanted to, and the leadership wanted to start off with health care, which ended up being a flop. It's still a flop, passed one house.
They're not the first president to make that mistake.
No,
right?
That's right. That's right. Now they're talking about tax cuts.
Yeah.
They're trying to find some cash cow to fund their tax cuts. And so as a part of tax reform, you could talk about increasing the gas tax, and you could talk about an infrastructure bill. Whether they will or not, all of these distractions here this last few days obviously takes away from infrastructure agenda, some kind of tax reform agenda,
anything else,
any agenda.
Right.
So we're in a mess because people aren't really addressing it. There's a lot of talk about it, but there's not much action.
I hadn't seen any. I was wondering if you'd seen any.
I remember when you were Secretary of Transportation, we played a lot of clips of you saying the roads are not partisan. The roads are bipartisan. Our infrastructure is bipartisan. Donald Trump last week floated the idea of raising the gas tax, and he immediately got some pushback from his party. Will Republicans go for a gas tax?
I think if the president pushed hard for it, that they could figure out a way to do it. They could figure out a way to get the votes. And my point in continuing the drumbeat that infrastructure is bipartisan and that there are no Republican or Democratic bridges or Republican or Democratic roads is that when you look at the time that I served in Congress in the late 90s, we passed 2 6-year bills under Chairman Bud Schuster's leadership. When Clinton was in the White House and Newt was Speaker, we passed 2 6-year bills. We had 75 members on the committee. All 75 members, both Democrats and Republicans, voted for these bills. That's what we need to get back to.
They were the days when you got things done.
Exactly.
I remember those days.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Precisely. And we had the money to pay for it, and we took care of America's infrastructure. So we proved that you can do it in a bipartisan way. It can be done in a bipartisan way. I think the current chairman, Bud Schuster's son, Bill Schuster, is a very bipartisan guy. He's tried to reach out to Democrats. And, if the direct answer is if Trump pushed hard for an increase in the gas tax, he'd probably be able to convince enough Republicans with Democrats. Boom.
We've seen that. When he pushes hard for something, the Republicans get in line.
Yeah.
You mentioned a couple of projects that I did want to ask you about, and one is the D.C. Metro.
Right.
I mean, I use the Metro all the time.
Sure.
I'm a big fan of the Metro system. But, it's a pain in the ass these days because they're have to do all these repairs. We're right across the street from the Eastern Market Metro.
Right.
And you mentioned escalator. This escalator's there. There are 3 of them. There's never a time when all 3 of them are working.
Exactly.
Right. And that's true throughout the system.
Yeah.
And so this is all a result of what? Deferred maintenance or?
Well, it's a result of not keeping up with maintenance with a 40-year-old system that needs more resources than it's been given. And they not only need to fix up the escalators and the elevators, but they need new cars. They need new infrastructure. They need the kind of preventive maintenance that'll prevent the kind of fires that have occurred from time to time that have shut down the system. It's more than money. Governor McAuliffe has asked me to try and help find some solutions. There's been a lot of studies done. But it really revolves around 3 things: the governance of the metro and how that is structured, how the 2 states and the district pay their share of the costs for operating metro. It's not just a D.C. metro; it's for the entire region, so it includes Virginia and Maryland in that regard. And then, of course, fares and the cost for people that ride the metro. So it's a combination of funding, governance, some legacy costs that, frankly, are weighting down the budget of metro.
And Amtrak. You may not remember, Mr. Secretary, but when you were Secretary, at one point you had been visiting, I think, the President, and you stepped out of the White House there was a cluster of reporters there. And I asked you about Governor Christie's decision not to put New Jersey money up to expand or to add another line or whatever in that tunnel from New Jersey into New York. And You were not happy with that question, and you ducked it, frankly, because I think at the time you were trying to still work something out with Governor Christie.
Right, and it didn't work out.
It didn't work, but that's a serious problem, isn't it?
It's a serious problem, and now you see Governor Christie and Governor Cuomo coming together trying to figure out, what to do about building a couple of new tunnels.
I mean, isn't it true that there's one line going each way, right?
Right, exactly.
With how many trains every day?
Yeah, it's just for thousands of people who travel on those trains, and these tunnels are in a very state of disrepair, and they need to be replaced. It cost a lot of money, and it was a very, very bad decision. Very bad decision.
And we just had a couple of derailments at Penn Station. Now they're talking about having to do major repairs there. This is another case, I guess?
Yeah, there's a project called the Gateway Project that will really address a lot of these issues, build the tunnels and fix up Penn Station, and Cuomo and Christie are behind it now, and it would be a part of a big infrastructure bill if Congress ever passed it.
So we are the wealthiest nation on the planet. Why is it that we have to go to Japan or France or whatever to travel on a bullet train? High-speed rail.
If Eisenhower in 1957 had signed the high-speed rail bill instead of the interstate bill, our country would be connected by trains. But
was it proposed at that time?
That's right. No, it wasn't proposed, but Eisenhower had the idea to connect the country with roads.
Right.
So in the event of some big emergency, people could get out of the cities and get away from whatever danger might be coming. And it was a good vision. I mean, we have the best interstate system in the world. We haven't kept it up, but it's a good system. In Europe, what they did, the national government made their investment in trains. So that, i.e., they have the best trains. That's what's happening in China. Every time you go to Beijing or Shanghai or anywhere, there's a new train line. Japan, they have the best trains. Spain, all over Europe, the best trains, because the national government made the investment. No state has the money to do it on their own. You have to have a national commitment. President Obama made that commitment when he put $8 billion in the economic stimulus bill. We gave most of that money to California, frankly, because Governor Brown decided he was going to have a train from San Francisco to L.A., and they're building it now. It's going to go 200 miles an hour. Think of the cars that will be taken off the road along that corridor. And that could happen in America if we had a national commitment to put our money into trains. We have a commitment to do the Northeast Corridor, and we put about 40% of Amtrak's budget comes from the federal government, but we don't have a national commitment either from the Congress or from an administration to say we're going to start putting our money into trains.
And is the vision there connecting major population hubs like L.A., San Francisco, right?
Exactly.
In the middle of the country, you're not going to get much.
Yeah, really. In my home state, when Pat Quinn was governor, we gave about $4 billion. He matched it with some of the state's money, and they fixed up the train line, which was a 79 mile an hour train from Chicago to St. Louis. Now it goes 110 miles per hour, and it's a direct line. The key for that, though, is there's about 5 universities: Illinois State University in Bloomington, U of I in Champaign, Southern Illinois in Carbondale, Western Illinois in Macomb. They deliver kids from the suburbs in Chicago on that train.
Got it.
And so it's very, very popular with college students, but it's also popular with, Illinois citizens. And it's a good train line now because Obama had the money. Pat Quinn decided he was going to fix up Chicago to St. Louis. Your point, connecting big population centers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But even on this Amtrak, even in this corridor, right? Mm-hmm. I use the train often, sometimes once a week.
Sure.
Between here and New York.
Exactly.
So they have the regular regional train, which is roughly 3 hours.
Right.
And now we have the fast train, the Acela, which is 2 hours and 45 minutes.
Right.
So that's still as fast as we can go. You ought to be able to do that in Japan, it would take you an hour.
Yeah, and Amtrak needs the resources to the problem is
Amtrak making money?
They're doing okay, but
of course that's not the end, is it?
I mean that's not,
the highways don't make money either.
Yeah,
right?
It's not really the goal. The point is to try and deliver people in a comfortable way. Yeah. There's a project that's underway between Washington and New York to put a maglev. Japan has invested millions of dollars, and some people, some folks are working on that. We'll see. We'll see what comes of that. They're looking for some private investment, and they're looking for a commitment, really, from the national government to be for that too.
Would it be the same roadway?
It would be obviously not the same alignment, but it would be, below and above grade. So
right. So as we move into Infrastructure Week, with this looming, what are you and Ed Rendell and the organizations you represent, what do you want to see happen? What are you really calling for?
The Congress to pass a transportation bill, a significant bill, not some kind of a chintzy, rink-a-dink bill that just sort of maintains everything. We want a bill that raises the gas tax, looks at tolling, looks at the infrastructure bank, really provides a big pot of money to really enable this vision that Trump has for $1 trillion infrastructure program. And, Congress needs to really put its thinking caps on. You can't. We know what needs to be done. 80,000 structurally deficient bridges, interstates crumbling, transit systems falling apart. So give a big pot of money and then put a 6-year program together, and boom, you start America at least on a path to say to people, we're serious about infrastructure and serious about funding it.
And it seems to me, right, and what do I know? I'm just a talk show host, right, that ought to be a message, one message where you could have Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi and Paul Ryan standing alongside of each other with you and Ed Rendell and saying, this is one thing on which we agree. Yeah. Why not?
Right. Yeah, well, you got the Chamber of Commerce and the AFL standing together talking about it. And
think of the jobs for one thing.
The jobs and the job creation, economic
by
development.
The way, and Donald Trump standing
right, exactly,
right there too.
Exactly.
So I mean, it's something so obvious. It's just why can't we make that happen?
Well
we're counting on you to make it happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be on your show to promote it.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Jonathan Allen, Charlie Peters, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.